Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Félix, and I'm here today with Kate Farrell, a graduate of the School of Library and Information Studies at UC Berkeley. Kate has been a language arts classroom teacher, an author, a librarian, a university lecturer, and a storyteller since 1966. She founded the Word Weaving Storytelling Project in collaboration with the California State Department of Education, funded by grants from the Zellerbach Family Fund to train educators at all levels. And she has published numerous educational materials on the art of storytelling. Kate edited the anthology Wisdom Has a Voice, Every Daughter's Memories of Mother, and she co-edited two other anthologies, Times They Were a Changin', Women Remember the 60s and 70s, and Cry of the Nightbird, Writers Against Domestic Violence. Kate is past president of the San Francisco chapter of the Women's National Book Association and a presenter for the San Francisco Writers Conference. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm really happy to be here.
I am so excited to have you here.
Yeah, to start out 2022.
Here we are, getting it off on the right foot, hopefully. So Isaac Dinesen, in one of your epigraphs in your book, Story Power, which we're going to talk about, he says, to be a person is to have a story to tell. So at a very high level, because of course this could be an hours long answer, but just sort of philosophically, why are stories important?
Right. So yes, it is that answer could go on for quite a long time. But basically, just to boil it down to a little kernel of knowledge, is that we already are storytellers. We're constantly telling one another stories ourselves. Just on a daily basis, we have a voiceover that is always interpreting what's happening to us. It is our own narrative. It's how we make sense of the world. And oftentimes it could be that narrator voice that is criticizing us or reminding us or, pinching us or doing whatever. But there is that voice within us. And when we take ownership of our own narrative through the art of storytelling, then we give that chaotic kind of random understanding, mosaic of our experience, and we bring it into a shape. So once we do that, once we have a shape and can begin to create a clear beginning, middle, and end, then those stories, if they're pivotal stories, if they're significant ones, they then become part of our own daily voiceover.
Right.
So we're informing ourselves by building clear archetypal stories of ourselves. So that's one reason why they're important. And in that case, it doesn't matter who hears those stories because, it's who we're made of, and we're telling ourselves and enriching our sense of identity and purpose.
Right. And what about, this is another question that could be, days in the answering, but again, at a high level, just the history of actually telling our stories then orally, the actual history of storytelling, because it goes way back.
Right. So stories, as you said, we're made of stories, and it's the first language. So the way I look at it is that we experience life and we generally live in time and space. And as we go through experience, it is a linear progression. And we understand because we live that way in time every day. And so when we want to interpret an event, we tell a story about it because we understand that's how we live. So it's sort of the three-dimensional time-space continuum, and we are part of it. We can't go back, we can't go forward, but we want to understand the fullness of one experience. And so we artificially create a beginning, middle, and end.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and from the very beginning, when people would, very primitive people would see natural phenomenon that was very terrifying, perhaps like what happens, in a wildfire or an earthquake. They would begin to tell the story about it, that there were, if we're talking about the California native people, they would say that the world is built on the back of a turtle. Of course it is. Don't you see the ridges of the hills and valleys, just like the back of a turtle? Well, when the turtle moves, the earth quakes.
Who needs fault lines when you've got a turtle? Who needs fault lines?
Right. So it helped to make sense of what was nonsense, what
the natural world.
The natural world. But then as the oral tradition became more of a piece of literature that really developed a more in-depth sense of symbology and imagery, it then became a kind of dream language for us to understand the deeper sense of what experience really is. What are the qualities that we're here to develop, in myth, in heroic quests, and even in the folk tales that would be moralistic or have so-called happy ending, that they would celebrate the enduring and sustaining qualities of human life.
Right. And so that takes us all the way back, basically sort of to the pretty close, if not to the beginning of time. But let's jump forward to today. I mean, it seems to me as if storytelling, insofar as actual, the telling stories in public, with whether it be the Moth or TEDx or organizations like Stagebridge in Oakland, it seems as if that sort of formal storytelling is enjoying sort of a resurgence. Is that the case, or am I just paying more attention to it?
Actually, you're right, but the resurgence really started in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So about the time, especially here in California, when there was the hippie movement, and then there was Back to the Land and folk songs and Joan Baez and all the good folk singers. Then at the same time, there was a resurgence of the down home folks, coming out and telling the old stories. And that's when the big resurgence really took place.
Interesting.
And that was about when I graduated from UC Berkeley as a librarian, and when I was trained in the professional art of storytelling. Okay. Because even before the resurgence in popular culture or counterculture, librarians in the public library, the children's librarians, had been trained and were expected to be storytellers.
Interesting.
And so we were taught the techniques that I actually use in my own work.
Okay. I want to take one step back further in history, but your specific personal history, because it's interesting when you first realized, in the book, you refer to it as coming out as a storyteller. Can you tell how you kind of, where you first realized, wait, I'm really interested in this form of communication? And do you know what I'm referring to? Way back when you put on a show?
Oh, right. When I was a child.
Yes, when you were 10 years old.
Right. So my family grew up in the South. I grew up in the South. And I think one of the reasons that I do love the oral tradition is that I grew up in the 40s, and there were no television sets, and we actually didn't own a radio, and we were constantly moving, and we were living in areas in which the oral tradition is very strong. So almost pre-literate. So, and yet very much across race, across ethnicity, there is just a different sense of time. So you could sit down and talk to somebody and tell your story, and it would be fine. You could just tell your own ghost story, whatever.
Right.
So when we lived in the south side of San Antonio, all of us kids were free to roam wherever we wanted in the neighborhood without question. And one day when we first moved there, I went off to the playground and I saw the public library across a busy street. And I found the children's librarians very helpful. And they pointed out Andrew Lang's fairy tale books. And each one of them is a different color. The rainbow fairy tale books from the 20s. And I was a very good reader. So I took these books home, loved the fairy tales. I felt, as a child with very little security and very little stability, that those stories were empowering and were giving me a sense of the happily ever after, overcoming the impossible odds, that over and over again, the sense of faith and purity and purpose were at the heart of all these stories. So I loved them, and I would read one book after the other. Then I decided one day I was going to put on a play of my own fairy tale. And I asked my little brother, who was 5 years old, if he would take one of the parts or some of the parts.
Giving him his big break.
I know. and he is very precocious and a wonderful toddler. But anyway, we practiced. But when the day came and the children came, I actually had tacked up little signs on the telephone poles in the neighborhood. And when the children came, I started the story, the play, and my little brother was so shy that he ran into the bedroom and hid under the covers. And so I had to take all the parts myself. And that was the first time that I was a storyteller.
I love that. So you started at 10, and it sounds as if you pretty much haven't stopped since, all the way up into the 70s when you became a librarian and that became part of your skill set. But then if we jump one step further to last year, then you've published Story Power. And of course, you published a whole bunch of other stuff, like I said in your bio, relative to storytelling. But can you just tell us just quickly kind of what motivated you to write Story Power now?
Okay. So I was very much aware that back in the 70s, and through the project that I had funded in education, that the only stories we were telling were from the oral tradition, the old tried and true, and that we were encouraged to, learn from all cultures. But that really became problematic. And I mentioned this in the book because of cultural appropriation, because of the way that the stories were built on patriarchal society, the way that women are portrayed in those stories, all of those factors meant that those particular stories from the oral tradition were going out of vogue. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, about 20 years ago, when the Moth started and TED Talks and all of these other venues for story slams became more and more popular, I was very much aware that storytelling had a powerful place in our culture, at the living art, and that it was being transformed into a new kind of folklore. And that was the personal narrative, the truth that each one of us learned firsthand from our experience. And so I wanted to return to the art and focus on personal stories, mm-hmm. and use what I knew worked really well, right, with thousands of regular, ordinary teachers who never thought of themselves as performers, but were able to use the techniques that I'd learned as a librarian and could easily see how they would work impersonal narrative as well.
Right. And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which it does work in personal narrative. But let's get philosophical briefly again for a moment. Just again, in a sort of nugget, why is it important, or, what are the benefits, or I guess, why is it important to give oral voice, to literally give voice to a story versus writing it down, just kind of at a high level?
All right. So at a very high level, again, just to go back to the constant voice, the chatter we hear all the time, and trying to harness that in our own conscious voice is very powerful. And what is so different from writing it down is that we are sharing it immediately, ideally in a live environment with a listener, with an audience. And that creates a whole different dynamic. Not only is it heard, not only do we experience being heard, say it's at Freight and Salvage in Berkeley and it's a packed crowd. That story is being internalized by every person who's there listening on the edge of their seat. And when that happens, we start to understand our story in a new way. So there's a very co-creative interplay with the audience, the teller, and then the story can actually change even in the middle of telling it.
Right. And we're going to talk about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about how it changes in the adaptation, but go ahead.
So it's good to be self-reflective.
Yep.
Absolutely. Every single literary form that encourages self-reflection is valuable. What's different about storytelling, live storytelling, is that you become aware of what you just said. And it's lit in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And something you say that it also does is, and this is specific to, again, not only telling it orally, but telling it in front of a live audience, which of course, hopefully we're doing unless we're rehearsing in front of the mirror, but that added element that the audience brings to it, you say, is telling your story. This is a quote from the book, quote, "Telling your story to a live audience is the point of maximum change." So what sort of change are we trying to induce, and how, again, is doing it in front of an audience sort of essential to that, to inducing that change?
Right. First of all, it's lights, camera, action. It's lit. It's charged. It's charged not only with what you say and what you're thinking and your subtext and your own emotion, but if you're at all open to the energy that's in the room, or even if you're in a family setting and you're at the table or in the living room, if you're aware of the energy that's coming to you, then you begin to hear yourself and know yourself because they're listening. And, what's really great in an informal situation is, even though say it's a family member, will be listening to what your story is and might say something just quickly, and that will help. But what I've noticed, say in the classroom, if I'm working with a story and I'm beginning to tell it from my heart, from my authentic self, and it's hitting them, they're getting it. The level of silence, the depth of silence, the way you can feel that, the way you can absorb that deep attention is really so gratifying and builds who you are and helps you understand what that story was all about.
Right. So it really is a two-way street. The audience is benefiting, but then the storyteller themselves, they're also seeing things in a different light, largely because they are telling it to a live audience. And so they're seeing it differently than they would otherwise. Like we started this part of the conversation with, they're seeing it differently than if they were just writing it on paper. They're getting a different sort of feedback and perspective. Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the things that I loved about the book, or love about the book, is there are, so like what we sort of, it sounds as if we've primarily talked about thus far, in my way typically of thinking about storytelling typically is the moth, or it is, like you said, a story slam where it's about entertainment or inspiration or connection. But you also have quite a bit of the book is devoted to sort of what I'm going to call practical applications of storytelling. Right. And what I mean is, of course, in day-to-day and even professional life. Mm-hmm. And you talk about 3 different types of stories that sort of fit into that realm. There's defining, signature, and personal branding. So let's just talk briefly about personal branding, just as one of the 3. Why and how why is it beneficial to tell a story, for example, in the marketplace, to present myself professionally versus the PowerPoint presentation or a list of my achievements, sort of the more traditional way of saying, here's who I am professionally, hopefully you'll hire me or want to collaborate with me. How does a personal branding story, why is it potentially better, and how does that work?
Sure. So one of the things about a story, again, is that not only is the listener hearing you, but they begin to experience it as if they were actually living that story. So the transfer is what is the marketing point. So I know before the pandemic, there was a huge trend for personal branding stories that were the best kind of marketing. And every corporation was trying to find their branding story because they understood that if someone could begin to identify and empathize with the corporate mission through the story of it, then they would be more connected. So it's the exact same dynamic, but in a business marketing platform.
And you even talk about how the brain works a little bit differently when we're processing stories versus processing sort of left brain data. The brain even engages differently.
Right. The brain actually is more fully engaged. Was that actually in the book?
That's in the book. That's in the book.
Yeah, so it is. So what happens is that it's only that front lobe, right, that is interested in analysis, and according to brain theory. So it's only that part of the brain that is so dominant in our male-dominated patriarchal culture that we think that that's the best way to approach. But more of the whole brain, when a story is told with enough credibility, so it has enough sensory layers, you begin to use the part of your memory that remembers smell or taste or sound. And then if there's an emotional component, that part. And then just the back part of your brain that has to do with emotion and memory. And then it's a living thing. We used to say in education that if you're telling a story, it's a whole brain activity.
That's it.
That the student is actually very engaged, and truthfully, that if they're listening and identifying with that story, it becomes another lived experience.
Right. And that goes back to the power of what we were talking about. And then the power of then the person being able to identify with that story, because now they've lived it. They have a sense of having lived it. And so they can identify with it in a way that they can't their PowerPoint presentation, even though I used to be so good at PowerPoint once upon a time. I think people definitely identified with my PowerPoints, but no, what were you going to say?
But you could still work a story into a
PowerPoint. Right.
So it's not like one or the other. It's, using both back and forth. And
right.
The way they do in TED Talks.
Yes. So another thing you say along these lines and sort of the practical applications that I thought was really interesting was this notion of building a repertoire of stories. Right. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So I wanted to mention a signature story because it's that particular signature story that's in the book I have used to pitch to foundation, pitch to publishers, pitch to trainers,
This is the
people,
Chinese folklore based story, or is that a different one?
no, it's my story. It's
Your personal,
story.
it's your personal,
Right.
that's right. The personal signature. Yeah.
It's when I was a first year teacher in Bayview Hunters Point, and the students I realized were not able to read or write at grade level. And I began to read all of the textbooks aloud.
Yep.
So this one day I decided, well, this is really boring. And I was behind the lectern, which was plywood made in the wood shop. It was very rickety. But I decided to forget that book. It too many side notes. It's boring. I walked away from the lectern and I began to tell the myth in my own words. And when I did that, standing in front of this class of ninth graders, you could hear a pin drop.
Right.
They were completely engrossed. We were connected. So all of the power we're talking about took place. And I never forgot it. I never knew that I could even do that. And it took nothing, no money,
Right.
no funding, no book,
No computer.
absolutely no computer. So that is my signature story. And the practical application for that is just what you said about the brand story. But it shows that I, in that profession, was a problem solver and was able to overcome what seemed to be an impossible situation through this particular technique.
Right.
So that's why I was able to pitch it to the seller box and to the publishers, so forth. And then they said, well, I want to know how to do that.
Right. Right. And so the signature story, though, you have this always in your back pocket for when you need it. This is part of that repertoire idea that you have a certain set of stories that you carry around with you for if and when you need them. Can you speak to that a little bit more for people who might not be thinking those terms? Because I found it interesting, this idea. I usually think of coming up with stories in these sorts of, in the practical situations that we're talking about, sort of on the fly. So I really liked that notion that have your signature story prepared for when the situation arises, and have your defining story for, can you speak to this idea of having these in our back pockets for when the situations arise?
So this kind of goes to preparation for telling a story, I think. So whenever using the 7 steps,
but don't get to that yet, because we're gonna talk to that. But yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just saying that.
Yeah.
A story to tell is not a story you've memorized.
Right.
It's a story that's like an accordion. It has a clear structure, as we've said, but you can stretch it out. And I have done that in classrooms. I can tell you, when I needed to get to the end of the period, when the bell rings. Or if you're in an elevator and you need to tell your story in 5 minutes or, quickly, it can compress. So it's flexible. The only thing that's clear about it is the structure, beginning, middle, and end. And your sense of it, your authority around it.
Right. But you have it at the ready for when you need it, and then you adapt it to the circumstances.
Right. And okay, go ahead.
No, well, I just, you go ahead.
And that also is true for social events or family gatherings, meeting someone for the first time, having a sense of your own kind of special stories that might break the ice.
Right. So let's say I'm someone who hasn't really given much thought to my stories and to coming up with my stories. What are some ways that I could start collecting the stories? What are ways that you recommend for people who haven't necessarily thought in these terms to start gathering stories? And maybe they're not ready to choose which one, but just to start getting that raw material. How do we gather the stories, collect the stories that we might later want to tell?
Right. Well, I think there are 2 definite ways. One is to follow your emotion. What part of your past, what part of your experience is emotionally charged? And I think that is how many of the storyteller prep, the coaches who are working with Moth and Marsh and other live storytelling performers, go with emotion. I've actually sat in on some of the classes, and I know that's what they do. They want to get the juice. They want to make it, what part of my life was traumatic? What part was terrifying? And then, but then I find that very difficult, because if you're just working with emotion and improv, you're not going to get to the structure. So the other way of doing that is to really use your emotion, but then develop it into find one that has emotion, but develop it into a structure, and then infuse it with emotion. So you might do something we used to do in workshop. Think of an age, 7, 8, whatever, and really remember who you were then. So it could be a timeline. It could be a photograph. That's charged. It could be a significant event, like a wedding or funeral. It could be an adventure, where you were challenged, where you didn't know what was going to happen. People love those stories. Or it could be a very challenging time. So some of the themes I have in the book are ones that people generally gravitate to tell.
Right.
And the family stories, for example, I find that people are very, very much interested in telling their family history, family legacy, stories about mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa.
Endless material there.
Right. And so it's just a matter of what's significant, what comes up. If you close your eyes and you think about it and all these images come up, which one sticks?
Right. Something else along those lines, two repositories for finding those stories that you mentioned, also is journaling and dreaming. And I do a lot of both of those. And I just like that you mentioned that. Any thoughts on how journals and dreaming can also help with this?
Yes. So I find that dreams are incredible. And if you keep a dream journal, it will usually connect to something in your past, in your psyche. And that might be just a fascinating story to tell.
Yes.
So, but journaling, yes. So journaling is a good starting point, but I don't know how you keep journals, but usually mine are very much free write.
Right.
And so to pick one and then begin to develop it into a clear narrative. And I do have to say this about the fact that at the beginning you mentioned we're made of stories. We want to know the end. We are hardwired to want to know how it turns out. And so if you have a journal that's ongoing, you might be able to tie it to the complete experience over time.
Over time. Right. So Linda Joy Myers in your book. So Linda Joy was on the podcast a few episodes ago. She's founder of the National Association of Memoir Writers, and she's in your book. And as are a lot of other writers, a lot of contributors sharing their perspectives on the themes in your book, which is a nice addition to the book. But she said something that I loved with regards to choosing stories. And so I want to ask you, about this, because we just talked about, we've gathered all these stories from the emotion or from our journals or from our dreams, wherever we might have gathered them. But now we need to choose. So Linda Joy says, quote, "A story to be shared is one that will not leave you alone." I just love that notion. I love that notion. So any thoughts on how to choose which story out of the ones that we've gathered?
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And I love the story she shared in the book, that it was based on a dream. It was based on,
oh, yes. The heart. Yes. Now I remember. Yes. That she actually had that dream. She needed to call her friend or ex-lover. I forget what it was. But
high school boyfriend.
High school boyfriend. That's what it was. Yeah.
Right. And she knew he was dying. But that was so
because of the dream. Because of the dream.
And
So
she
powerful.
called and she was able to visit him before he passed away. But she understood something about herself because she took that time. And that was such a beautiful shape that she returned to her young self, discovered that she'd always been loved, and her sense of who she was changed. So that was very powerful in that she had to then reconstruct the emotional pattern of her life because she never knew that or internalized it when she was a teenager. But now in her later life, on a deathbed, her own narrative changed. Her defining story changed. So it's a very, very powerful way of saying if a story doesn't let you alone, it's trying to tell you something.
Yeah, I just love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something else you mentioned is just the importance of the stories. I mean, we tell stories and we talk about this in writing all the time as well, right? And it's particularly memoir. We don't want to just tell our experiences because we're trying to get them off our chest, for example, to oversimplify, but we want to tell them because they're going to have some sort of universal resonance where like we talked about, like with the audience, like so that the people in the audience are also getting something out of that. Can you talk about that notion of this universal resonance or universal value, as you say in the book?
Well, I think the micro is macro. So I think if you're telling a moth story or a story in a public venue or even to your family, oftentimes you don't fully understand what the universal layer of that story is. But if you sit with it for a while and you really tell it to yourself, and what I say in the last part of my 7 steps is to learn it by heart, but not word for word, which means to learn what it means to you, your authentic truth. And the deeper that each storyteller can reach that place, then it becomes universal.
Right. So let's talk about that notion of the 7 steps to preparing the story. And I was just going to call out 2 of those, and you just called out one of them. So let me just, in the interest of time, I'm going to read the 7 steps, and then let's talk a little bit more about this notion of not memorizing, because I think that's really a distinctive, really important distinction about storytelling. But your 7 steps are: select a story, which we've been talking about; learn the structure, which you've referred to, and I'm going to ask you the essential features after this. But learn the structure, visualize the settings and characters, tell the story aloud, learn it by heart, and practice telling until it comes naturally. But again, you say you're one of the 2 that I want to call out there is that you're learning it by heart. You're getting to know the story by heart, but like you just said, you're not memorizing. And so why is that? Because I think it's really important. Sometimes you'll see storytellers and it's kind of obvious that it's pretty word by word and you can kind of tell it's not, and that's not really storytelling. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Right. So the storytelling art, did I show this already? The story?
Not yet.
Okay. So this is pretty much what I use when I'm doing a story. I've been doing this for quite a long time. Storyboard is just, generic. I mean, you can find this anywhere online, but it includes sketches as well as keywords. And what it allows you to do is see it. The important thing is to see the story, to visualize it in your mind's eye, which is probably some part of the brain further back. But visualizing it, reliving it, is the most important part of storytelling. And if you tried to so earlier today, I told a little story about going to the library and finding the
fairy tale books.
That was actually a story, but I did it almost like a throwaway. But if I wanted to create it more intentionally, I would frame it and make sure that I was hitting the points. The story itself is a lived experience because you want someone else to live it. If you're memorizing, what do you think you're visualizing? you're visualizing a text.
Right.
So you have to separate from the text and see it. So in the 7 steps, after you structure it in a way, and the old storytellers back in the 70s would use index cards with keywords. That's it.
Yep.
And that would be their repertoire with the rubber band around the index cards. So they pick up a story. Oh yeah, this is the Iron Maiden. All right, I remember. And maybe what you remember by heart to memorize would be the first 2 lines.
Right. And then you're off and running.
Then you're off and running, and you have to know that when you're off and running, you're actually visualizing it. And as you're speaking the story, you're projecting all those images. It's almost like a holograph.
Well, I think that's such a huge distinction, because you're right. If you've memorized it, you're not seeing the visual, you're seeing the words. And so you can't have the same emotion. You can't create the same picture. And so yeah, really big distinction. Okay. So we've mentioned a couple times, or we've alluded to, I should say a couple times, the features of a story. So let's just talk about, can you just kind of give us a rundown of the key features that every story should have? Just some that come to mind. You've got like a list of, again, it's around 7 usually, and I'll throw some in, but some of the ones that just come to mind that need to be in every story.
Okay. So first of all, there should be tension. And that's the most important thing, is that it's not just, it's something that happened when you were a kid that you walked to school, but there was a problem. There was an obstacle, just like any good short story, flash fiction, personal narrative, there needs to be rising action. And maybe it's not incredible tension because these are, our repertoire of everyday stories. So it could be just tension, or it could be anticipation, or it could be surprise, but there needs to be a rise because it's a hook. You want people to know the best stories are the scary ones, or the ones that make you feel like, oh my God, what is going to happen next? But, it could be a more mellow sense of that. Nevertheless, it starts out with rising action.
Right.
And so I used to talk about this in the workshops with a slinky, those little slinkies. And yes. I would say, all right, look at the coils of action in this slinky. If we pull them apart, look at how they stretch and, how they're moving, they're in motion. And also you're looking at the beginning, that's going to be a solid first start. And then at the end, it should be of equal weight.
Right.
So that the story is satisfying, it connects.
Clear resolution. People don't want to have loose ends in the art of storytelling. Right. So the other thing is that sensory imagery, clear characterization, and dialogue possibly. It seems like sometimes dialogue isn't necessarily used as much as it could be. Is that because it seems like that's a really effective, and you even say in your book, even just 1 or 2 lines of dialogue can be really effective.
It is because dialogue again makes it a more alive.
Right.
It makes the people speak. Help
them come to life.
It does. So those are the elements, and without those, it just falls flat.
Right.
It's slinky goes.
Can't make it down the stairs.
No.
Okay, so let's talk about, we just talked about, before we talked about some of those main features, we talked about the fact that we're not memorizing the story word by word. And so part of that, consequently, and I think we might have already touched on this a little bit, but part of that, because I haven't memorized my story word by word, it's going to change a little bit each time I tell it, which, like I said, I think we touched on. But I want to read, you say, quote, in the book, quote, "A story when told is never perfectly performed because it is always changing. Spontaneity modifies and adapts the telling to each new audience and situation." So how do you and you talked about this a little bit in the elevator context, but let's talk a little bit if I'm at the Moth, or if I'm at, one of the story slams, and my story, how do I know, how do I adapt the story, and how do I know? Because Linda also says, I want to add this. She talks about, she says, measure how listeners will react along with developing an awareness of our own need to tell as part of what goes into adapting. So can you just talk a little bit about that concept of adapting the stories?
Right. I think Linda Joy was saying, some people have, in her work particularly, and she deals with a lot of trauma, abuse, etc., in her memoir, and as a therapist.
Right.
So she's basically saying, how much can your audience hear in terms of trauma?
Mm-hmm.
How much can they absorb without being overwhelmed?
Right.
But my point might be more to craft. If you're working with a very, very restless audience and they're not able to settle for some reason, then I've found it very effective to slow down and to take use of what we call pregnant pauses.
Yes, I love that term. Yes.
So that they why did she stop? and so that actually, so minimizing gestures, slowing down, pausing to a point will bring the focus back. In other words, you're working with a invisible sort of art form. So, what I said about the holograph is that if the holograph is kind of wobbling around, you want to steady it and ground it and anchor it. But if there is a need to move more quickly, then you might sense that as well. So pacing is one thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think, something that comes to mind is something you said earlier, you said a couple times, is that notion that when the audience goes completely silent and you know that you've got them enraptured. So if you know that you've made that connection, then maybe the pregnant pause is a little longer because you want to draw them in, or maybe it's shorter because you've already got them. It's going to vary according to the circumstances. Right. But I think that also goes back to our conversation about the live audience and how it is an interaction, and you're kind of getting cues from them to speed up or to, slow down, like you said.
Right. And then the other part would be the emotional layer. So if you feel that they're very connected emotionally, and again, I don't know the mysterious way that subtext is communicated in performance, but you know that it is. And so one of the ways you can do that in the structure, and this is done in theater, I know they do it in Moth as well, is to give each section a kind of emotional beat. Mm-hmm. So you might start out with anxiety, and that you can project anxiety. Or you might start out with humor and then it becomes anxious. Right. So if you are aware of your emotional beats and you've built it into your performance, and sometimes I'll use colors to show a different beat. Then, and if the emotion is not getting through, then you could just adapt to that.
Right. And one thing, you just referenced subtext, and one thing that you underscore in the book in each section is how research helps you to bring in some of that subtext, and research in the sense that you don't necessarily include what you learn in the research in the story itself, but it's helping you as the storyteller to nonetheless infuse some of that.
Exactly. And I know it matters. I know it makes a difference.
Right.
So it has to do with the authority, the way you present the information, the sincerity, the authenticity, the way it's framed within yourself. So all of these skills are oral art.
Right.
And I believe that they do help with public speaking, they help with TED Talks, they help with every kind of person-to-person communication. Because even if I'm in a very quick situation with someone, I'm trying to convey an experience, I know that I'm seeing it. I automatically go into camera action. I'm seeing it immediately. And I know that adds to it, and it adds to the effectiveness of what
the delivery. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and other overlap is something that I was going to ask you about in next, which is just the vocalization aspects. And you talked about pausing. That's one example, but there's so much. And I think for me, oftentimes also, even if we're talking about a reading, let's say it is an author reading, and it's even more so true, what I'm going to say for storytelling, but even for a reading where someone is reading the words, sometimes I just think, God, I wish they'd put more into the vocalization, because sometimes I think authors, a lot of the times, they're not necessarily performers, right? They're not necessarily storytellers, and they're not presenting themselves as such. But sometimes I'm listening to someone read their work, and I thought, and I think, I wish they'd inhabit that a little bit more, because the vocalization is so important. So can you talk about that, whether it's reading a story or in the case of what we're talking about today, more for storytelling? Tell us some of this. Let's touch on some specifics, like, breathing from the diaphragm is really important. And so many people, I think, don't know that. But what are some other things we need to keep in mind as we're actually delivering vocally? So
taking different voices is one way to do it if you're reading from fiction or your own work. And it can be just subtle. It doesn't have to be overdone, but to really give a voice to each one of the characters. Another way is to interpret it so that you're experiencing it yourself, and probably having a coach help you to do that. Possibly working with someone in your home or a friend or something, so that they could listen and say, "Oh, I really liked how you did that." Infusing it with emotion. Using pause, being very clear in your articulation, and this is probably the most important, eye contact.
That's my next question. Yes, tell me about eye contact.
So a storyteller is hungry for eye contact. They want to connect with everyone there. And the same thing is true of public speaking in a live venue, if you're able to see who's there. But even if you don't, to imagine that you do.
Act as if.
Focus on someone, in the near distance, and then in the far distance, and then someone you can actually see, and keep moving your contact around. So that is, again, what's creating that holographic, common experience through the eyes. Do you see it? I see you. I always think of it like a tent, like the circus tent for the story. So we put up the big tent and we fill it up. And the tent is as big as the audience. That's the space where the story actually lives.
Yeah, and I think the surest way to get someone's attention, if they're not necessarily paying, maybe you're the third storyteller that night or something, and maybe people are starting to, is to get their eye contact. Because to your point a moment ago, when they know that they're being seen and they feel seen, then you just draw them in, right? I mean, if I'm in your class, or if you're telling a story and I'm kind of looking at my phone, and then I look up and your eyes are on me, probably a glare in that situation, then you've got me, right? Then my phone is dropped and I'm back with you. So the eye contact, yeah.
Eye contact is so great. And in terms of author reading from their own work, I know they believe that every single word is precious, but it really isn't. If it's paraphrased, if one or three, words are dropped or changed, it doesn't matter.
Right. Look up from the book if we're
Look
talking about
up,
a reading.
interpret it, be there in the action, move it into the room, and they'll want to buy your book.
Right. And I think for me, the word is interpret. I think that's the thing. I think a lot of times if we're talking about readings again versus storytelling, oftentimes I think authors think, well, I'm just reading. It's like, no, if you want to draw people in this context, you've got to be interpreting. You've really got to kind of come out of your shell a little bit if it's not necessarily something that's natural for you. If you're not a performer, you got to do a little bit of that though, if you want to keep the listeners' attention. Right. And then of course, even more so if we're talking about storytelling. But
those are excellent points.
Before we wrap up kind of this part, and then I have one last question because we are nearing the end of our time, but any common mistakes that we haven't necessarily touched on, whether for someone who's just getting started, things that they want to look out for if they're going to take to the stage, for example, for the first time, or even for people who have been doing it for a while, but they're just common pitfalls that even they might kind of need to keep in mind. Anything that comes to mind along those lines?
Right. Well, what I've noticed is that, as I said before, depending too much on the emotion, thinking that the emotion will drive the story to a satisfying conclusion is not necessarily true.
Yep.
We'll see someone begin a story that has emotional impact, but it just sort of spirals out there someplace, sort of pre-associating with something else. And so that sense of structure is so important, because how did the oral tradition survive? Because it was in a clear shape. And some of the ways that people learn how to share a story is to have the action very clear in mind and often repeat it, so that it would repeat 3 times, or there would be a clear obstacle that needed to be overcome, then it's episodic, etc. So all of that makes it easy to remember and stay with the audience. So I would say lack of structure, depending too much on charisma, depending too much on emotion, thinking that theater is improv, it ain't.
Right. Right. It's not. Well, that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, right? We've talked about don't memorize it, but it's also not completely improv on the other end. I mean, that's right. A great point that we haven't talked about, that probably some people probably mistake it for that. I
think they do. I think so. And then the other part is to over dramatize with gestures, with movement, with very stylized segue. So you'll have one character and this image will be that character, this gesture. That is annoying.
Because it's also not theater.
It's not theater, and it's like the Victorian, remember the sort of the poses of Victorian women, very stylized, very repressed. Again, be real. Don't let the hate props.
Yeah, don't use the crutches. Don't
over dramatize. Be there.
Okay. Some great advice. So the last thing, because like I said, unfortunately, we are nearing the end here, but something interesting that we talked about offline and that I just wanted to ask you about because it seems pretty timely is the chapter 5 of your book. You do address motifs and archetypes, or sort of notions or concepts that have been with us sort of across generations, across cultures, which is one of the reasons archetypes are so fascinating. Humankind all over the place has come up with some of the same notions that are pivotal and essential to their traditional stories. But you talk about in chapter 5, some of those archetypes and how they're classified and the motifs. But then you also talk about how today in contemporary society, not surprisingly, it's now focused more on me and the personal story and how we're kind of moving away from some of that. But you also told me how you kind of realize it's not necessarily one or the other, and that there might be a cultural need to bring them both together. Can you speak to bringing together the traditional and the more contemporary personal, how we do that and why it's important?
Right. So I think it's a cutting edge. It's sort of something that started in my mind, I thought, well, there is all of this rich material. Some of it is dreamlike. Some of it is simply deep, subconscious understanding of truth. So it's very easy to match up a story from the oral tradition, if you know them well enough, with a personal experience. And I've noticed that some very, very gifted storytellers are beginning to do that. So they'll start out with an experience of their own, and they'll see that it fits something that actually is a fairy tale. And they'll weave it in and out, and they'll literally begin to tell the story, their one, and then move to a segment of the fairy tale or folk tale, and then back and forth, back and forth.
Interesting.
And it's fascinating. So I think it's a work in progress. I think it's very experimental. And what I do believe is that in our time right now, we're so challenged, and we want to know more, deeper. Who are we? What is the bedrock of who we are? And how do we get back there? How do we find that deeper sense of self that isn't political, that's not religious, but it's just a way of knowing? And since we're made of stories, it's going to be a story. And the ones that were told from the very beginning are the ones that are still true. So if we can wrap our own sense of journey with the quests and the trials of these ancient stories, I think we're going to understand who we are better.
And that's the point, right? That's the point of the stories. But I love, because we started this part of the conversation by saying, and you tell me if my take on this is right, because this is on the fly, but we talked about how we're getting away from the traditional stories and the archetypes and the traditional motifs and going for the personal. But then it sounds like this braiding, as you call it, is actually of the personal with the traditional, is actually affirming, wait a second, there's a reason these stories and these archetypes have lasted so long, because they are in fact still true. And it's almost like me focusing on my personal story, but then bringing in the traditional is affirming these universal, long-standing traditional archetypes.
Right. And it's this symbolic language that is so much deeper charged. If you handle archetypal material for a while, it's exhausting, because the meaning that it has is pulling on you in so many different layers of yourself. And to have that connect to what you personally have experienced is only going to enrich it and make it more meaningful.
Right. Help you make more sense of it. Yeah. I love that.
It just seems to me that, you want to know, how do stories change your life? And it kind of assumes, well, what do we want out of life? So how do we know if we're getting there with a story? And over this last year, I've been thinking that really what we're here for is to discover the person we already are. Right. Getting to the essence versus, yeah. Right. And you see that with people quitting their jobs, so many people resigning. That's not who I am. Right. Who am I? So we're really, not that it's so me conscious, but really deeper, who is my essence? Who am I? What is my gift? How can I give it away? What is my purpose? Looking for the authenticity. Right. So as we disengage from the busyness of career and institution and consumerism, etc., then we start to look at different measures of success. Right. Getting rid of those old stories in favor of
the stories we've been telling ourselves, we need to have that high powered job or whatever it might be, that I need to have that new car, relative to consumerism, getting rid of those stories, hopefully in favor of ones that are more, again, about our essence.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
And the old stories always had to do with the internal work.
Love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Two quick sort of administrative almost sort of questions. So one is, I'm just assuming that given the pandemic, I assume that some of the storytelling, I know you just had a storytelling event online, so some of it's moved to Zoom. Is any of it kind of starting to, I know it's so day by day with the pandemic. Anything going on in person, or is it all still kind of on Zoom and probably reduced for the time being?
No, there was a flurry of first openings in December.
Yep.
And I don't know. I think people are scared.
Yep. And rightly so. It's a very confusing time. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I guess it is related to storytelling, but I can't remember if I mentioned this it wasn't in your bio, but you just finished a memoir manuscript. So one, I wanted to congratulate you on that because that's huge. And then I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about it or if it's still too early to talk about it, but I at least wanted to acknowledge that milestone.
Right. So I wanted to mention the book too.
Yes.
And really when I wrote the book wrote sample stories for each one of the 9 themes, it was like priming the pump. I started to remember so many of these events and one kind of led to the other. So I began to work on my own life. But I wanted to do it in the context of the archetypal feminine quest. And that seemed like, oh my goodness, how could I possibly frame my life in that way? And yet I think it worked out. And I now am sending it out to beta readers, developmental editor. And when I did mention earlier in the year that I was working on the heroine's journey and that was going to be my memoir, there was so much interest, so much all of a sudden people, I can't wait to read it. And so far, no one has said it's too crazy because so
far.
So what I'll do is I'll start out with an experience, and then I'll weave in a classic story from a variety of cultures. But by the time I left home and went to college, then I could really braid in more heavily because that's when the quest would really start.
Began. Right. Well, we are all looking forward to that. And so again, congratulations. And it sounds like you're just flying forward with that. Very exciting. And I can't wait to read it. So thanks for sharing that little tidbit about where you are with that.
Thank you.
Thanks for just sharing with us all your knowledge and experience about storytelling. So exciting. And it is going to be so exciting when we can kind of get out and do it in person again, but we're doing the best as we can, given the circumstances. But where can people go to find out more about you and more about the book?
So my website is katefarrell.net.
.net, not .com, people.
Right.
.net.
The katefarrell.com is a very well-known poet.
Okay.
So she and I have sort of had a parallel life.
Right. I'm sure.
For decades.
I'm sure.
Are you that Kate Farrell? No. She's the poet. I'm the storyteller.
Right. All right. It all works. There's room for both. So
absolutely.
katefarrell.net, and that's 2 R's and 2 L's, by the way. Kate, thanks again. Yes. One last.
Oh, no. Thank you, Matthew. I really, really appreciate being able to share. And the last thing I think I want to mention is that even though performance is curtailed, getting together with friends and family is still so precious. And I've discovered that having that repertoire of even that I actually have taken stories directly from the book and told them because I thought, hey, this'll fit right in.
Right.
So I just have to remember not to tell it to that same person. But they would probably say, oh, I heard that.
I already know that one. Yeah. I already know that one.
But it's great to be in a situation, a social situation, And if you have the clear intention that you're not just talking, you're telling, it really pulls the whole group together and makes a different dynamic and encourages them also to be authentic.
Yep. All right. So people, keep on telling stories. Check out Story Power to learn how to do it better. And check out Kate again at katefarrell.net. Thanks again, Kate. I am Matthew Félix. More about me at matthewfelix.com and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including how to register for this year's conference, which just got moved from February, from President's Day weekend, got moved to this July. So it's going to be July 21st through 24th. We hope you can join us. You can register now, like I said, and you can do that at sfwriters.org. Until next time, thanks for joining us.